Thank you for putting me in this slot where it's appropriate to my time zone, and I'm sorry I had to miss so many um, interesting talks. More importantly, I'd like to thank George Walkden for for bringing us all together, and all the other organizers of this conference. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
we can. Thank you.
And so a round of virtual applause to all of you. And I'd like to start actually from the issue that just came up about possible differences between morphological and syntactic change. I guess you can see my screen. Misparsing is a very well documented type of morphological change, and there are all these examples from English article being reparsed with a noun, so we get a newt from an eft, etc. And it's widely assumed that there are syntactic analogues to such morphological changes. But convincing cases have turned out to be pretty hard to find. And it's been argued, notably by Whitman, that they actually don't exist, and that apparent instances of misparsing are actually grammaticalizations involving category change and not parsing or resegmentation of the constituent structure. And he proposes that the reason is that syntactic structure is an interface level that feeds phonological and semantic interpretation, which prevents misparsing from becoming the input to syntactic change, whereas phonology, let's say, and perhaps morphology are not anchored in the same way. I'm going to suggest that this is too strong and that misparsing can take place, but it happens when other changes render the original structure unlearnable or hard to acquire. Let's take some classic examples where Whitman is clearly right. So, for example, where do complementizers come from? There's an old theory that that comes from a demonstrative pronoun in parataxis, and that other that-like complementizers have the same origin. So I believe that he left is reanalyzed as I believe that he left. I find it very hard to imagine a learner so dumb that they couldn't figure out the difference between two clauses and one clause on the basis of available syntactic criteria. And in fact, it's much more plausible on the historical evidence that clauses come from relative clauses. And this is what we see certainly in Latin quod and Greek hoti, pu, Sanskrit yad. So something like, I believe it that he left with prodrop, I believe that he left, and analysis of the resulting structure. So that is originally a relative pronoun. And of course, there are other sources of a similar sort without rebracketing. So prepositions or verbs or case elements that govern the complement. So we can actually see this happening in Sanskrit. We have an old Vedic structure in which we have a relative pronoun anaphorically linked to an adjoined explicative or appositional clause. something like this or namely, or such that. And we have the omission of the head in later post-Vedic Sanskrit, which actually gives us a structure that is string identical to through that clauses and survives as that in the later language. Similarly, for complementizer, there's a traditional account, which I think has been pretty much refuted by Garrett's discussion, and has been in general abandoned. So the arguments which go back to Jespersen for its origin by rebracketing just simply don't work. And a new complementizer in English that's arising is where. I can see where I'll have to be telling her, again, this is clearly a relative structure which is being introduced into the language as a new complementizer. There is a problem that I am worried about and want to talk about today, where reanalysis is much more plausible and can be documented in the language over the last 400 years. And this is in Finnish, where a type of propositional complement, very similar to the English gerund, has originated from a much smaller structure. This is I'm going to argue, a CP structure, really a sentential structure, headed by a participial form of the verb. And Harris and Campbell, in their textbook, propose a rebracketing analysis in which there was an original raising structure, which was reanalyzed. Let's see if I can find the slide. So you can see, here's an Old Finnish example. So this is the original structure that they posit, a raising structure where the subject of the participle becomes the object of the governing verb and gets case from it, and then raising is lost, and the case is retained and becomes a fixed genitive subject of this embedded clause. I have to explain this notation. So when we talk about Finnish, we have to distinguish between abstract case and morphological case. So famously, the abstract accusative can be a morphological accusative, it can be a morphological nominative, it can be a morphological genitive. And I've indicated that by subscripts. So here's the paradigm of structural cases. We have a different paradigm for nouns than for pronouns. We have a distinction between 4 structural cases in the pronominal paradigm and 2 different mergers in the nominal paradigm between accusative and genitive in the singular and between nominative and accusative in the plural. So to keep track of all of that, we need to indicate what the structural cases are, both in terms of abstract case and in terms of morphological case. And just one important thing you need to know is that in singular nouns that are objects of subject less verbs, we get a nominative object for instead of an accusative or genitive object. So the problems with the scenario that Harris and Campbell propose is that the phonological change was completed long ago, before the change it supposedly triggered. The majority of matrix verbs are actually intransitive and don't assign case to objects, and that the propositional participle clauses actually don't have syntactic raising properties. What I want to show first is that the modern clauses, the PPCs, are like finite sentences, and in particular, their genitive subjects are true external arguments, that they are CPs, and that the participle is verbal, not adjectival, like most participles. So argument one, that is that you have no possessor agreement. For example, tiesit minun ampuvan karhun. You can't have the first singular agreement with the subject, which is otherwise the rule for all other participles and all possessors. So you have obligatory possessor agreement. The only place where a genitive does not agree with the noun that it modifies in person is in this one construction. And that's the only case where that genitive that is actually not a specifier, but has a higher position in the syntax. So here's illustration of possessor agreement for the regular cases. My bear, as I shot the bear, or the bear that you shot. In all of these cases, you must have obligatory agreement. The one case where it fails is in the structure we're talking about. Secondly, we have subject to subject raising. Possessive genitives and genitives that are associated with other participial constructions never do that. So it turned out that they were related to bin Laden. They turned out to have been related to bin Laden. The genitive subject of the participle can appear as a nominative with the appropriate class of verbs. Third argument, extraction. Subjects can be extracted from the PPCs just as objects can. Kenen väitit ampuneen häntä? Who did you claim shot at him? Kenen väitit hänen ampuneen? Who did you claim he shot or shot at? Otherwise, possessors or other genitive specifiers of participles cannot be extracted. This is the left branch condition. And there's some illustrations here. I don't have the time to go through them, but the slides will be there. So this once again shows that this structure is different from all other participial structures, and it has the properties of a finite clause. Argument 4 is that the genitive subject behaves as a structural subject for case assignment purposes. Jansson's rule, which I mentioned, which determines the distribution of nominative objects versus accusative genitive objects, treats the genitive subject of the PPC as a structural subject, just like that of a finite sentence. argument 5, it's a general fact about Finnish that you can have missing subjects, but they can't be possessors, or they can't be genitives associated with other participial constructions, but they can be of this particular one participial construction, the PPC. So you can say siellä väitetään voivan tanssia. It is claimed that one can dance there. Or siellä väitettiin voitavan tanssia with a null subject. But you can't do it with a possessor. You can't do it with any normal possessor, but you can do it with the subject of this particular participial construction, the PPC, as in this sentence. So where does the structural case come from? Where does this genitive case that marks the subject come from? I've shown it's a structural case. Structural cases have to be assigned by something. What assigns the case? Well, it can't be agreement, because the participle is invariant regardless of the case of the subject and the number. So there's no agreement relation. Here you have a plural genitive subject of the PPC, invariant participle. Here you have a possessor, subjectless case, again, invariant participle. It can't be from the matrix verb, because that can be of any sort. It can be intransitive. It can assign a different case. Still, you get the genitive. And here are some examples. So the remaining possibility is that the subject gets genitive case from the complementizer. And that's presumably the invariant ending N of the participle, which I have actually already been glossing as C for complementizer, which is affixed to the participle and arguably is the head or the complementizer that assigns case to the subject of the clause that is its complement. Since the PPCs are full CPs, they're extended verbal projections, so their heads, it follows, should be verbs. Now, verbs have the property in Finnish that they can't be compounded. And in fact, these are the only participles that can be compounded. Sorry, they are the only participles that cannot be compounded, since they are verbal. This is illustrated in sentence B. It can be mentioned that the testator's spouse is present. Läsnä oleva is a compound of present and be. No other participles allow compounding because they're not verbal, they're adjectival or nominal. I'm sorry, all other ones allow it because they are not verbal but nominal. So läsnä olevan puolison vakuutus, the present spouse, puolison läsnäolo, a nominal form, all allow compounding. It's precisely again, the PPC, where compounding is prohibited, showing the verbal character of this participle. So I'll assume something like this structure here. So there's at least a tense and aspect and a voice that among the functional categories that is available in these PPCs. So they fall short of finite clauses in not having a polarity phrase or a mood, but they have a bunch of functional categories that are otherwise missing in participial clauses. Now, Old Finnish is totally different. The subject gets case from the matrix verb. The downstairs subject is not invariant in roughly 85% of cases. It bears accusative or either of the genitive or the nominative form, and in the remaining cases it has genitive or partitive under the appropriate conditions.
Paul, you have
namely,
Paul,
a few
I'm sorry.
minutes left.
Yeah.
Thank you. The attitude verbs favor genitive subjects dramatically. The Old Finnish data, by the way, are from a book by Pirkko Forsman Svensson, which was written in 1983 based on 2.5 million word corpus of Old Finnish. So it's of Ellegardian proportions, long before electronic corpora became available, an amazing piece of work. So predicates in the Old Finnish version regularly agree in case and number with their subjects, as you can see here. And you get variation in agreement. Compound verbs are okay. Here are two examples. So the PPCs pattern as objects in modern Finnish, but not in Old Finnish. I won't have time to explain it, but they pattern definitely with nominal objects in for purposes of various syntactic phenomena. And the internal case assignment has been increasingly favoring the nominative over agreement since the 17th century. Anttila and Kim have an article, a very beautiful article on the quantitative variation patterns. These go hand in hand with the fixing of the genitive subject and of the invariant form of the participial head that we find in the modern language. So the idea is the Old Finnish counterparts of the modern PPCs are actually small clauses. And the idea is that the small clause structure independently disappeared from the language. So examples of small clauses outside of the PPC, which were grammatical in Old Finnish, are shown here, where you have a participle clause. Sorry, here's the participle clause modifying the head. These are all ungrammatical in the modern language. And the argument is that the loss of the small clause structure resulted in a reanalysis as PPCs. So when the small clause structure was lost, you could no longer analyze the participial structures as complements of perception verbs, and they were reanalyzed as this larger participial propositional clause, which was then generalized from perception predicates to attitude predicates. So here's a case where independent changes in the syntax force a reanalysis of a structure because the structure can no longer be parsed in terms of the existing syntax. So this is in a way a footnote or modification of Whitman's proposal. It's not that you can't have syntactic bracketing, but you can have it only when independent changes in the syntax or perhaps in the morphology force you to. That's it. Thank you.